Dear church, let's talk about science and faith. Hello, welcome to the Dear Church podcast. I'm your host, Chris McCurley. I'm excited about today's guest. I've got Joe DeWeese on. Joe, former member here with us at Walnut Street, moved his family to Henderson, Tennessee to take a job at Freed-Hardeman. We're still not happy about that. I mean, we're happy for you guys. We're not happy that we lost you, but you guys come back quite often, which is great. We love seeing you anytime we can get you. And I know you're doing a great work at Freed. I know you love the job there. Also, for our viewers and listeners, your wife is on staff here and helps with our finances. And so we're pleased to have Liz with us. And just a family that we love dearly. And I love the work that you're doing, and I wanted to have you come on and talk to us about science and faith. I know that apologetics is something that's in your wheelhouse, and we had another guest on here a few months ago, David Reeves, who's opening the Wonder Center here in town. I know you've been helping him with that as well. It's kind of a creation museum experience type of thing, and so all that to say, wanted to have you on to talk about various things related to science and faith. But before we do, just, I kind of gave away some of it, but tell us a little bit about you, about your family, and how things are going there at Freed.
Sure. Thank you. Thanks for having me, Chris. It's an honor and a blessing, and glad to get to join you here today. I am originally from the St. Louis area, grew up just outside of St. Louis, Troy, Illinois. My folks and siblings are all still up there, and moved to Tennessee to go to Freed-Hardeman University, graduated from there in 2004. Liz and I were married in 2002, and in 2004 we moved to Dixon. We didn't know anybody there. Literally called Walnut Street and said we need a banker and a realtor, and someone to help us find a place to live. And they did. Some great people there stepped up, and so we were able to work with Alan Reagan and Ted Williams and other folks, and lived in Dixon for 17 years. I did graduate school at Vanderbilt University. I have a PhD in biochemistry. And then went from there to teaching at Lipscomb University in their College of Pharmacy. So I taught science to pharmacy students for 12 years, did research, had a research lab there. And then in the midst of the pandemic, Freed-Hardeman contacted me and said, hey, would you move here and come teach biochemistry? And so we ended up doing that in July of 2021. It was a really challenging thing. We loved our time in Dixon. We love our friends and brothers and sisters there, and definitely miss you all. But we're also glad to be a part of the work here. Of course, we have Lucy and Jed. So Lucy was born in 2012 and Jed was born in 2014. So we're uprooting them as well, from everything they knew. But they've adjusted well and they're doing well. We live here in the metropolis of Henderson. We have just outside of town. And I've spent the last couple of years here teaching biochemistry and molecular biology, and also serving as director of undergraduate research. And it's given me a chance, of course, to continue teaching things that I really enjoy, but really to dive in more to the Christian evidences and apologetics side. So one of the reasons I went toward science was to pursue evidences, apologetics, things like that. And so I'm finally getting to kind of get to do some of those things and really engage in that. And that's been a real blessing to me to kind of get to explore those realms. So at some point, we'll have to have a conversation with Justin Rogers. He and I are teaching a course on Bible and science. We can talk about that as well.
Yeah. We had Justin last week. He did a great job talking about Job. Let's dive in talking about this false dichotomy between science and faith, because I think that our culture has promoted this idea that you've got to pick one, that you got to choose a side. But I know that you feel that the two, and I feel the same way, that the two go hand in hand, that in fact, when you read through Scripture, you see that science and faith are not in opposition, but that they actually correlate beautifully. Talk a little bit about that false dichotomy and how it is false.
That's right. So everyone has seen the headlines, science versus religion, faith, faith versus science, science versus God, just these different types of headlines that try to paint that picture that there has to be this conflict between the two. And what I hope to help people understand is that, if we really believe, for instance, Romans chapter 1 and verse 20, that God's invisible attributes, his divine nature and eternal power, are seen in the things that have been made, then ultimately whatever we discover from a scientific perspective ought to be in harmony with his revealed will and word. And so that's really where I'm passionate about this, trying to understand science. I think the challenge here is that many scientists approach the world, their philosophical and theological perspective is that they're essentially we might call it materialists or naturalists. They believe that all that exists is physical, material. There's no supernatural. There's nothing beyond nature, so to speak. And so if I'm approaching the world from that perspective, then yeah, I'm going to be in conflict with, God and his word, which is inherently otherworldly, right? Supernatural. And so when we think about that, if that's my commitment, is to a materialist worldview, and my commitment is to try to explain all the material world given that, then yeah, naturally I'm going to be in conflict. But what I'd like for people to consider is that that's only one approach to science, and that for hundreds and thousands of years, really, many people who are believers have engaged in science and done so without contradicting or conflicting with God and his word. And that's what I'd like for people to consider, is that you can do this, you can be a scientist and not have to, engage in a conflict with God and his word. Now, are there things that are challenging to understand, explain? Absolutely. And even those of us from a creation perspective, we got a lot of work to do to try to understand more about how this world was created and about how things came to be the way they are now. But that being said, we can do that in a biblical framework. We don't have to do that in a framework that is at odds with a creator.
Yeah, this opposition, would it be safe to say that it's the effort to explain away God? That, science, I've heard, about this more than I do. What I've dabbled with in science, the science is all about examining what you can see, what is real, the evidence. Yeah. But considering all the evidence, wouldn't you have to at some point, look at least the idea that there is intelligent design that, of course, we call that designer God. But is it really an effort just to dismiss God and explain away God? Do you think there maybe is a slant or a bias there when it comes to this false dichotomy?
Well, I think for some people it is. So I don't want to paint with too broad of a brush, but sure, it's clear from what some people have said that their goal, their intent was to not have to deal with God or not have to have a God. So if I'm going to be, a scientifically literate, accurate person trying to explain things all from science, then yeah, I've got to be able to explain, where did the universe come from, right? Where did matter and time and energy and space, where did that come from? How did the world form? How did life begin? How did life diversify into what we have today? And so that's what you see people doing is building theories around each of those key critical points that they realize have to have an explanation. We've got to explain where all this came from. We've got to explain where all of the animals came from, where life started. And so, yeah, there are a lot of folks out there trying to do that. And, in some ways it's them justifying their worldview. For sure, that's what it is for some people. For others, it's just, well, this is what we do. We just study things. But it's interesting that in God's commission to Adam and Eve, he said, essentially reproduce, fill the earth, subdue the earth, have dominion over it. And I think that's part of science is understanding the planet, understanding how things work, having that dominion over it. I think is natural to what we as Christians ought to be doing. And yet somehow we've allowed kind of the naturalists to hijack science from us when it was really naturally a part of who we are.
Yeah, I kind of think on the other side of things that Christians, and I don't want to paint with a broad brush either, but some Christians, I should say, have kind of bought into this idea of, well, you just got to believe. You just got to follow blindly. Blind faith we talk about, which is an oxymoron because I don't think there's any such thing. But also, God or Jesus never asked anyone to follow blindly. In fact, Jesus constantly said, consider the evidence. And when you consider the evidence, like you went to Romans 1 a while ago, which is a really good text for what we're talking about, is just look around you. I mean, all this came from somewhere. And obviously, I'm biased in believing that it came from God. But I think that sometimes Christians can, maybe buy into this idea that, well, you just got to follow blindly when that's really not true either, right?
That's a good point. We see a couple different reactions among the church toward science. Okay, some people, we just need to avoid it altogether, right? We don't need to engage in it. It is, bent against God, and so we just need to avoid it. They teach their young people that scientists are just, they're all against God and whatever. And I think that's an extreme. And obviously we need to avoid that, because that doesn't really reflect who God has called us to be.
Right.
But yeah, there are some people that look at it and say, well, we got to have faith, and we can't dig into it because that might, what if we find something that disturbs our faith? And again, I come back to Romans 1. If God created it, there's nothing in his creation that's going to be inconsistent with him. Now, our understanding may be limited of it, and we may have challenges explaining it. I point to, for instance, there are some creatures that were preserved in the fossil record, I think, during the flood, that indicate that life before the flood got really, really rough. There was a lot. I mean, you think about dinosaurs and some of these other creatures. Is that what God created? Did he allow? What about, you've got pit vipers and other types of snakes and creatures that have amazing features that allow them to, kill, other creatures. Are these things that God created? So there are some things we have to really think through, like what roles did those things serve, and how, why did God make creatures with certain capabilities or features? Why did God allow viruses? Like how did he make them? Where did they come from? These are questions we have to wrestle with and try to understand. And I think a lot of it can be explained, in my opinion, if we consider that maybe part of the fall of Adam and Eve included some of these things changing, and maybe going from maybe a useful purpose to one that maybe is kind of a more degraded purpose that can cause harm. And so I'd like for us to consider that, it's a challenge for us to explain things, but that doesn't mean we have to shy away. It also doesn't mean we have to turn a blind eye and say, I'm not going to look over there, because if I look over there, it may make me question my faith. No, he's called us to have a confident faith and an assured faith. And you think about even Hebrews chapter 11 and this idea that, faith is part of what justifies us before God, right? He who comes to God must believe that he is, and that he is a rewarder of those who seek him. And so I want us to consider that we don't have to shy away from these things. They are difficult, they are challenging, and there are things that we may not be able to answer. And I think that's what some people struggle with, is not having an answer. And that's where I've come to as a scientist. I've had to be able to say, there's a lot of things I just don't know, and I'm not going to know, and I'm okay with that. It does keep me from having faith.
Yeah, I was going to mention that, at some point there's always going to be question marks. And obviously I come from a view of a creationist worldview. But even the scientist who dismisses any thought about God or any part that God might play in all this, even he or she is going to have to come to a point of faith, right? Because we're all going to fill in the gaps or the question marks with something, right? So we're all going to have question marks, and so you have theories on the science side because of that, and of course they would say that ours are theories on the creation side of things. But at some point there's question marks that you just throw your hands up and say, we just don't know. But then you've got to go from there, right? And that doesn't dismiss everything. It just means that you've got to be able to admit that we just don't have all the answers, right?
That's right. Yeah, there are times where we have to step back and say, what can I know and what do I know, versus what am I maybe never going to be able to answer or address, and learn to be okay with that. I've met people who've told me, I've got to be able to answer this, or I don't know what I'm going to do. And I've had to tell them, look, there's some of these things you're never going to be able to answer, probably this side of eternity, right? We may not, right? We all have that list of questions that we think in eternity we're going to ask. Now, we probably won't care as much about those when we get there. But there are things that we'd love to know and love to understand and love to grasp on a deeper level. And as creationists, some of our ideas are going to turn out to be wrong. And some of the things that we've kind of thought, okay, maybe this is the way it is, those things are going to over time change, and that's okay. That's part of the scientific process. And we've got to be open to, gathering new information, incorporating that into our understanding and growing. It's this attitude or mindset that sometimes says, I'm not going to learn anything beyond this because I don't want it to question or doubt my faith. I don't get that. As I went through graduate school, it was a really challenging experience. And there were times where I started asking myself, what do I really believe? What do I really know to be true? Because as I sat reading all of these scientific papers, all using the same kind of philosophical, theological framework to look at science, right? They don't say it that, right? No scientific paper says, here's my theology and philosophy. They just put it right down in there and embed it into the write-up of the information. And I started thinking, is that what I believe? Is this true? Is this real? And I kept coming back to a few things. And for instance, in my research, I study a protein that's a cancer drug target. It's a little enzyme, and its job is to keep your DNA from being too tangled. And I kept coming back to the question, how does this little not untangler machine develop on its own, right? Where does it come from if there's no creator designer to make it? And I kept realizing this is one example of thousands of different enzymes that are equally necessary and important for life. So I have no other way to explain this other than to say, this thing is an amazing little machine that had to have been designed. And not only did it have to be designed, it had to be designed in an operation at the same time as hundreds of other enzymes and proteins had to be working. And the only way we get a system like that is for it to all be engineered at once. We use the phrase sometimes irreducible complexity, and there's an incredible degree of that in a cell. And the concept there is that if any part or piece is missing, the system fails. Right. Well, God designed systems much like we might today engineer systems for cars or various machines, where you got to have all the parts and pieces working together. And if you're missing parts or pieces, it's not going to work. And that's the way I view the system. Is it's an engineered system, and as an engineered system, we ought to be able to kind of reverse engineer and figure out, how does it work? What does it do? How does it do what it does? And actually, I've been to conferences and sat alongside engineers talking through, okay, here's how this thing does this. What's the analogy over here on an engineering side? And those have been really fruitful discussions. Rather than sitting there saying, how did this thing evolve? We're saying, how was this thing designed? And you actually get to, I think, better answers that way.
Yeah, absolutely. Again, coming from a different viewpoint, you have to admit that from the beginning, right? So coming from a creationist viewpoint, when I study science, of course, not anywhere to the degree you have, but when I study science, it all just makes sense to me and points to God, the creator. Why do you think there are so few people of faith in the science field, or is that just a misperception?
No, that's not. I don't think that's a misperception. I do think that we are, those of us in science who are people of faith, are heavily outnumbered. And part of that is maybe this draw toward naturalism, toward not having a creator, not being responsible to anyone, right? Because if there is a God, I'm responsible to him. So some of it is probably that. I think another reason that it feels like so many people lack faith, one is I do think in science there is a push toward naturalism. There's a push toward, at least for some people, philosophically, this is kind of the accepted viewpoint. And now all those people are in charge of the major journals. They're the professors at the major institutions. They hold all the gates, so to speak, and all the keys. And so if you're going to go through this pathway, you've got to kind of be in line and lockstep with them and in agreement with them, or you're not going to get the grants and your funding, or your papers are not going to get published, et cetera. So, if we were to openly write in some of the journals I submit to about exactly what we believe, it would just get rejected before even going off to review, because that's, there's kind of some gatekeepers kind of protecting things, so to speak, and keeping that from being the case. But I will say this, lest we think that it's just everybody in science, doesn't believe. I think far more people believe than we realize. They just don't have a voice, or not allowed to have a voice. And I've gotten to know a number of researchers. So something I've done for the last, I guess it's been 5 or 6 years now. We have about once or twice a month, a Zoom call with scientists and researchers of faith, and it's people from all around the globe. And we have, a presenter, someone's presenting on their research, they get feedback. It's just become kind of this neat kind of, one of my friends calls it an invisible college, because we're all learning from one another, and it's something, we don't advertise it. We don't put it out there. We don't post the recordings or anything like that. But we have, this community that we're building And this is just one example. And there's other communities like this with thousands of other researchers throughout the world who recognize, hey, this system was designed. And here's the thing, Chris. What I've seen in the last 10 years or so of really digging in deep on some of this, as I kind of got my job settled in at Lipscomb, I really started shifting my focus toward looking more and more deeper into this, making some of those connections. It really started about 2015 when I really got deep with this. But what I'll say is there's a trajectory in science where for a while it seemed like the evidence was pointing further and further away from Scripture. It appears to me that things are swinging back more and more toward being in line with Scripture, in the sense of looking at things like the fact could there have been an Adam and Eve, right? Could that have been a reality, for instance? What about understanding how animals diversify? Could that happen really rapidly? Because it would need to happen pretty rapidly after the flood for us to get to where we are today. And the evidence indicates those things can happen, and that we can see that, and that actually is very possible. And so it's interesting to see the pendulum swinging back toward, this is starting to make some sense. Now, there's still things to figure out, but I'm encouraged by it. The folks I interact with are quite encouraged by it. And what we also see is that the whole Darwinian paradigm, which would say that life evolved as a branching tree-like structure from an original life form using mutations and natural selection, that framework is crumbling, because what they're realizing is that natural selection at best really is just a filter. It only gets rid of bad things. And mutations don't generate real new, meaningful information. If I'm going to go from a creature swimming in the water to one that can be on the land, walking around, breathing oxygen on the land, there's a lot of new features and structures that have to be built to do that. There's no source for that information in evolution. It doesn't just happen. So where does that information come from? And that's the thing we have to kind of recognize, is that there's some major failings of the Darwinian paradigm that the more we look at, the more we realize that's a real deep challenge. I mean, what do we know about mutations in humans? Well, most of the time mutations lead to things like cancer. We're not getting better, Chris. We're actually getting worse. It's degeneration, right? De-evolution. And this is not good from a worldly perspective. Now, from a spiritual perspective, it ought to point us to Christ and our need for redemption, because this life in this world is not our hope. So anyway, those are just some things that come to my mind, as we kind of think about that.
Yeah, I like how you put that we're, if evolution is true and right, and it is the explanation of all of this, then we should be moving to something better. And what you're saying is we're regressing in a lot of ways. So talk a little bit about, you mentioned it a while ago, talk a little bit about some of the things that were eye-openers to you, maybe when you were questioning your faith and struggling a little bit as you're going through your coursework and things like that. Talk about some of the things that stand out to you that affirmed that, yes, science and faith go together. Talk about some of those, maybe some examples that really opened your eyes to all of this. Yeah.
Well, here's the thing about it. Sometimes we can get incredibly technical, meaning, we dig really deep and we're trying to find some real deep technical meaning. And some of the things that were the most meaningful to me were actually rather simple, more like common sense. You think about the origin of the universe. Where did the universe come from?
Yeah.
You don't get something from nothing, right? On a fundamental level, we all understand there's a whole lot of something here. If there was nothing before that, where did all the something come from? And you've got to have a cause that is adequate to explain the effect. And so I think on a fundamental level, that was something really meaningful to me. Like, that's kind of silly. It is, but at the same time, just understanding that, as you think about this process, all right, let's say that, there was some origin event where the universe came from. All right, the next challenge is, how do you get life? And the more I've studied biochemistry, the more I've realized life doesn't just happen on its own.
Right.
It is an arrangement of parts. And all of these parts and pieces have to be in there together, have to be interacting, have to be operating at the right way for life to even happen. In fact, one of the studies I saw a number of years ago looked at a really small, basically a type of bacteria. And it's a parasite, so it lives on a host. It had a genome that is relatively tiny. So E. coli, which is a common bacteria, has a genome of about 5 million base pairs. So think about 5 million letters worth of information, which is a pretty decent amount. This little organism has a genome that's on the size of 500,000, so 10 times less, okay? Much smaller. For this little thing to live, it has to have over 400 different genes present in its genome for it to survive. In other words, they went through and they knocked them out one by one and figured out, okay, it has to have at least these ones to survive. And which is pretty interesting because, okay, how does life begin if one of the simplest known organisms that we can find requires all of that information to be present all together? It's not just we can have a little piece here, a little piece there. You got to have it all together. Right? If we go out to the parking lot and pick any given vehicle, that vehicle could run, let's say, without doors or a windshield. Your truck could run without its tailgate or its hood, right? There are things that we could potentially strip off. But at some point, you get to that bare minimum. Think of like the classic go-karts, right? There's a bare minimum number of parts for a go-kart to operate, right?
Sure.
It could be simpler than what we might have in the backyard, but there is a bare minimum number of parts, and the same is true for cells. And the question is, how do you get all of those parts there at the same time, operating, cooperating, working together? The other thing too is this organism was a parasite, meaning it fed off of resources from a host. So it wasn't even making everything on its own. And that's important to consider as well, that these organisms are dependent upon certain resources coming to them from some source like a host. And so even on our simplest level, that's really not a fair analogy because you actually need a lot more than that. So just thinking about what I need to have for a cell to survive on the simplest level, it's pretty astounding how much needs to be there for all of that to work. Again, go back to the motor analogy. You got to have a certain number of pieces and parts for that motor to run and for that go-kart to drive. And without that, it just doesn't work. And life is the same way. We got to have a certain minimum parts. You take it to the next level. All right, we have life. How does life diversify into what we have? Now, from a creationist perspective, we would look at that as separate groupings of organisms that gave rise to the diversity we see today. So you got dogs, you got bears, you got horses, etc. These different creatures starting from some starting initial creature at creation, or you could even just go back to the flood, for instance, whatever the creatures were that were on the ark, that as they came off the ark gave the diversity that we see today. What we know now and what I've seen in my studies is that, okay, there are mechanisms for organisms to diversify fairly rapidly. In fact, God programmed that into cells through a process we call recombination. And so seeing that process in play and what it can create in terms of diversity is pretty amazing. I mean, even just look at the human population, shapes, sizes, hair color, eye color, skin tones, etc., all coming from two people, but really after the flood coming from three couples, more or less. And that's a pretty amazing thing. One note I always like to make here, Chris, about this is to think about Acts chapter 17, right? Paul says he made of one man every nation of mankind to dwell on all the face of the earth. I think we as Christians, by the way, ought to be against racism as much as, if not more than anyone else, because the message of the gospel is that we're all one race, right? We're all one. And we need to be communicating that. We need to be showing others love, regardless of what they look like, because we're all part of this one human race, this family that came by way of Adam and eventually by way of Noah and his sons and their wives. So
well said.
Pretty powerful message.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Hey, Joe, talk a little bit about the morality question, because it seems like that's where a lot of this hinges for someone of science who doesn't buy into the faith side of things. The question is always brought out, well, if there's a God, if there's an intelligent designer, then why is there so much evil in the world? And of course, I typically respond with, but how can you account for this moral code that all of us seem to have? I mean, so, you've got you got this tug of war there. Talk a little bit about how you kind of answer that question when it comes up.
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, on the surface, you say, well, wait a second, how are you defining evil, right? If you don't think there's
Sure.
a standard, what's your standard for determining evil? And so, that's a starter question. I think that's fair to ask. But I also think we have to consider, what are some of the sources of this evil? What are we talking about? And let's differentiate between, maybe the consequences of actions versus maybe just natural evil, things that we can't explain. Some of it maybe, there's a difference, let's say, between somebody who suffers because somebody else ran into them in a car accident versus, let's say, a hurricane, like just came through Florida. A hurricane came, destroyed homes, took lives, things like that. I think there's a fundamental difference there. In terms of why we suffer. And so I always try to differentiate what kind of suffering are we talking about, right? Are we talking about suffering based upon the actions of ourselves or others, or suffering based upon, consequences of just living in this world and experiencing some of the things going on? Another thing that I'd like to consider is that, when Adam and Eve sinned, God changed something about the creation. We don't know the extent of that. But he does give us some specific things that changed in Genesis 3. But what else changed, right? What else is going on now that maybe wasn't? And I also think that the flood, we underestimate possibly the effect of the global flood on the world. I mean, you talk about climate change. It was a massive climate change event, and it was catastrophic in nature. And perhaps some of what we experience today around this world in terms of weather patterns, in terms of various, earthquakes, things like that are going on, volcanoes, etc. These are all probably after effects of all of that movement that took place during the flood. So we have to consider that there's some consequences going on that really are an outcropping of the consequences of what God did during the flood, which was as a result of what people were doing in the world. So again, it almost comes back somewhat to our choices. And to the effects of those. It doesn't necessarily take it away. But the other thing to consider is that not all suffering is bad, right? And if suffering can lead me toward greater dependence upon God, that can be a good thing. Not that we might enjoy it in the moment, but that perhaps through it we come to a greater dependence upon God. And so I also like to consider that as well. But I've heard that argument a lot. That's probably the most used and probably one of the strongest arguments in the arsenal of those who are against faith, is to say, look, there's all kinds of evil going on. There's cancer, there's death, there's decay. How do you explain that? There are creatures that do really weird things in nature, killing one another, things like that. How do you explain that? Well, perhaps these are the consequences of the fall and of the flood, and things that are just continuing to play out in the natural world. It doesn't make it necessarily good in that sense, because we are in a fallen state. But as we look at Romans 8, this world is groaning together, right? And there is something greater to come. And that's what I like to consider, that there is something better, and perhaps part of experiencing suffering in this life is about pointing us toward God in our dependence and need for Him, and also of the great things that are to come, right? As we consider not the sufferings of this present time, but we're pressing on, we're looking forward, we're looking ahead to what's to come.
Yeah, and you said a couple of things there that go back to what you said in the beginning. Number one being, just the very fact that you accuse God of evil means that you have a standard. It implies a standard. So, how do you get a standard from evolution? But the other thing you said earlier was that, things are not improving. If evolution is evolving us to something better, that's not happening. Mutations, things of that nature mutations typically mean cancer, like you said, and things like that. So you've got to explain it. Either way, you're going to have an explanation.
That's right.
So as we're wrapping up here, we like to highlight the good on the Dear Church podcast. So talk about your research, talk about, what you're teaching at Freed-Hardeman. We may have some potential students that are watching that maybe are interested in this. So talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, absolutely. So again, I teach mainly biochemistry and a course called cell biology and molecular genetics. These are kind of upper division science courses. So typically students that are headed toward maybe medicine, pharmacy, dentistry, optometry. Maybe they're headed to graduate school, want to get a PhD in the sciences. So those are some of the students that I'll generally see in those courses, and that's a lot of fun. I do have a research lab, and so in the biochemistry lab where I teach, we do research as well. I've got about 10 students roughly right now engaging in research, and we're excited about that. We do have a summer research program where we try to spend about 6 weeks in the summer. We bring students in. We house them here on campus. They get a little stipend for it, and they spend about 6 weeks performing research, learning about the enzyme that we study, topoisomerase II. It's a fancy name, but it's basically, like I say, it's an unknotter of your DNA. It keeps it from being too tangled. And so we do that research in the summers. That enzyme, by the way, is a cancer drug target. And one of the things that got me into research, among others, but one of the big ones was my brother had cancer when I was finishing high school, getting into college, things like that. And so I got really passionate about that. Turns out my brother was treated with drugs that target this particular enzyme. Just kind of understanding how it works, how those drugs work, and can we make better drugs that target it to potentially save lives in the future. That's been a passion of mine. So the other thing we have going on that I want to highlight is the Bible and Science course that Dr. Rogers and I are teaching. Dr. Justin Rogers is an expert in Hebrew. Has a great understanding of Genesis, and I learn a ton from him. He and I team teach this course. It's in the spring here at Freed-Hardeman. It's an upper division course, so you have to be a junior, senior to take it. It's pretty intense, and we cover a lot of ground, and we cover both science and Bible discussions, kind of going back and forth on different topics. We invite in guest speakers. It's always fun to have, phone a friend and bring people in. We bring in astrophysicists, and we bring in wildlife biologists and other people to come in and speak to the class and talk about their disciplines and how their disciplines interface with particular topics we're dealing with. And we cover everything from the origin of the universe, the origin of life, the diversification of life, talk through Genesis, kind of the days of Genesis and the language of Genesis and things like that. All that goes into that course, which is a lot of fun. So hopefully people will be interested in that, consider taking that course and joining us for that. And if there's folks that are interested in what we're doing, obviously, send an email to Chris. I'd be happy to answer any questions or provide additional information. We got opportunities for people to support what we're doing and come alongside us and help us make this something that more students can engage in.
Yeah, absolutely. And I want to echo what you just said for all of our listeners and viewers. If you have a question about today's episode, you can email me at chris.mccurley@rippleoflight.com. And if you have a question specifically for Dr. DeWeese, we'll make sure that it's forwarded to him. And I know that he'll be glad to answer. And Joe, just thank you for coming on. I appreciate it so much.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I appreciate it. It's good to get to spend a little bit of time with you. And I'm sure we'll be back in Dixon soon. In fact, the Wonder Science Center, I'll be there next week. So
yes,
they're doing some great work. And so I hope people will consider going and visiting there as well.
Yes, that's a great work. Wonder Center here in Dixon, Tennessee. It's really a cool project. We had our Vacation Bible School there this year. And if you want to know more about that, let me know as well. David Reeves, who's been on the show, is coordinating that effort and does a great job. And I know you're helping him in that as well. So I want to thank everyone for tuning in. And until next time, may the Lord bless you and keep you. Sincerely, Chris.